Welcome to Break the Box, a podcast at the intersection of faith, entrepreneurship, and creativity. I'm your host, Jake Starkey. The goal of this podcast is to tell the story of other Christian entrepreneurs and creatives and encourage you to break out of whatever box is holding you back. If you're a first-time listener, I encourage you to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, Season 2 is coming soon, and we're excited to bring more of these to you on a regular basis. In this episode of Break the Box, we talk with Brian Mann about story and the importance of when and how to tell that story effectively. Here's my conversation with Brian Mann. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining us on Break the Box. And can you just give people a little bit of background on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I am a pastor in the Houston area and also a filmmaker. I've been a pastor for about the last 10 or 11 years or so, and been a filmmaker for about 15 years or so. I grew up in the church. I'm a pastor's kid, and so I've been around ministry my entire life. When I was a kid, I wanted to be the next John Williams, a Hollywood composer. So went to music school first in New York and then moved out to Los Angeles and learned how to write film and TV scores, did that for a while. But really since the Lord calling me back into ministry when I was about 21 or 22. So I did music ministry for a while and then got more involved in production and then got more involved in filmmaking, storytelling, just as a way of kind of connecting people's stories to a wider audience. So back before everyone was talking about storytelling, I feel like now story is like the big watchword, you know. And it's nice because it can sort of mean whatever you want it to mean. But back then it was just filming people's testimonies and just whether it was for a conference or for a church, people seemed to really sort of respond to that. And so I got kind of the storytelling bug pretty early on and have been doing that for the last 15 years or so.
Sure. So you say you felt the call at 21. How old are you now?
I am 42, so I am twice that age now. Yeah. So I've been at this for a while.
Yeah. And you currently work at a church doing that. And you were mentioning that, it's an interesting dichotomy to me that you were a filmmaker.
Yeah.
And the call to ministry. So what kind of stuff did you work on when you were out in California?
Yeah, so I got the opportunity to work on a couple of Mel Gibson movies. So I actually worked on the last two Lethal Weapon movies, which fewer people saw than the first two Lethal Weapon movies, but they kind of made them around the same time. I worked on another Mel Gibson movie called Payback, which is a big sort of shoot 'em up movie. And then I worked on a bunch of different one animation series for DreamWorks called The Prince of Egypt. I was able to be part of that sort of soundtrack. And then just some things for HBO cable series. What I did was either I was sort of the small fish in the big ocean. So I would be like an assistant, and I'd sort of help with recording projects, conducting an orchestra, that sort of thing. But I also did, as a composer, I started writing, film scores for a lot of indie projects and student projects and stuff that never really saw the light of day, but, it was a really good experience. So, I just got to jump in on all sorts of things and really enjoyed that process, especially the collaboration with directors. Because just the way I'm wired, I like to be able to get into people's heads creatively and sort of figure out what sort of story the director is telling. But, I was raised in the church, and so ultimately I didn't feel like that was what God had for me. I had moved out there. I had gotten a chance to do a lot of creative work, loved the people and really loved the environment, but just really had a very specific sense. No, I think I'm supposed to go into ministry.
Wow. That must have been not challenging necessarily, but it must have been tough when you're in Los Angeles saying, I think I'm going to move back and I'm going to get into ministry. I'm sure everyone was very encouraging.
Yeah, well, and it was, I actually started at a church out in LA, and it's funny, my dad's a pastor, he's just retired, and he was so excited that I would, usually you think of like staying in the family business, and he's been like in ministry his whole life. And when I told him like I was thinking of leaving Hollywood to go into ministry, like he was actually a little disappointed. He's like, I think I wanted a little better for you, and not because he didn't love it, but because he knows how hard ministry can be and how hard pastoring can be. And so are you sure? Have you prayed through this? Is this, this must be, this needs to be from the Lord for you to really, sense a call. But it was about as clear as it could have been. Yeah.
Awesome. So now you were doing storytelling, which kind of, like you said, is a buzzword now, but what do you consider, how do you find the stories to tell, I guess is a better question to ask. How do you hear a story and go, that's something we need to tell?
Sure. Yeah. In the beginning, it was just more sort of gut instinct. I was in positions where I was either, working as a creative arts pastor. So I was somebody that was sort of my job, to work with the senior pastor and kind of find stories that went with the culture of the church. But it really wasn't until a couple of years ago, we have a storytelling team actually that I lead at our church here. And we started asking the questions of what kinds of stories do we know we want to tell here? Because there can be so many kinds of stories. And not all stories, sort of in the same way, not all stories touch on the same theme. So how do we know, if we want to definitely tell this story or not that one? So we kind of came up as a team after asking a bunch of questions with 3, what we call sort of essential elements for storytelling in our church. One is the God element, which is probably the most, obvious. Sure. That if we're in a church, the God's probably going to be the major sort of, feature of the story. But, if we come across a story where it's really about how someone, was doing something bad happened and they're doing better, if God doesn't feature pretty prominently in that, we'll probably not tell that story. So that was the first one, is just that God needs to sort of clearly have intervened in someone's personal story for us to tell it, at least in a church. The second one is what we kind of have called the family element, which is, does this feel like us? Does this feel like our culture, like our family? Sure. Does this story kind of pick up on some themes that we know are really important to us? And does this feel like us? Does this sound like us? And that's pretty subjective, but we kind of know, and every church is different. So, our church, we say things a certain way. We kind of have a specific vision. We know our leaders really well, what they're passionate about, what we talk about all the time, what we do and don't necessarily talk about, but you sort of pick up on those cultural aspects. And so that does a story kind of feel like, oh yeah, this is totally our people will get this. So that's the second one, the God element, the family element. And then the third one is what we call sort of the Me Too element, which is like, are there things in this story where people can relate? Doesn't matter who they are. You know what I mean? We're not just telling stories about like spiritual superstars or people who are fostered, 29 kids and have moved to Zimbabwe and, right. have done things that just sound amazing. But like, I'm just like more normal people are just trying to kind of get through their Sunday morning. So we want stories that really not only can like communicate truths about who God is, but also communicate truth about how painful life is. Or, what it looks like to doubt God and God show himself faithful in the midst of that, or, just very sort of everyday things. And to me, that's where really the truth of a story is in that conflict and that pain that anybody can relate to. Because once you have people's attention, then I think that's when God starts to reveal some really deep insights about who he is and how he works. And so those are the 3 main things. First, does God feature in it? Secondly, does this feel like us? And then thirdly, are there things in the story that like don't take a lot of explaining? We're not here to impress people. We're here to connect with people. So can people really relate to it?
Yeah. Very cool. And I like the idea of we're not here to impress people. We're here to connect with them, because that's something that, you can always tell an outlandish story, but something like you said with the Me Too, where I know that I've experienced that where I'm sitting in church and go, yes, that is, yeah. I've experienced that.
And that's really what we want. And if you think about whether you're watching a movie or you're reading a blog or, you're watching a TED Talk or that sort of, or hearing a really great message, the ones that you remember the most are the ones where you're like, oh my gosh, thank you. Like that just puts language to something I've been feeling for a really long time. And like, that just helps me get over the hump of whatever you know what I mean? And that looks different for everybody, but those are the moments, those kind of, I don't know, aha moments, I guess, that we're looking to really make that sort of meaningful connection between whoever's talking in the story and the people watching it. Because I think that's really where God does a lot of really restorative work. It's like he takes a puzzle piece. There's like this gap in the puzzle, and it's kind of jagged, and this sticks out here and this sticks out here, and you can't tell, like, okay, what's that part of the image have to do with this part of the image? And then God just puts the puzzle piece in, and all of a sudden you zoom out and you're like, oh yeah, okay, man, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But I also think there's a huge power in knowing that you're not alone, and knowing that you're not the only person who's ever had that thought. The Bible says no one's ever been tempted but what is common to man. So there's this sense of connection when you realize, like, holy cow, like, I thought I was the only person who ever walked into church feeling like a complete failure as a parent, or I thought we were the only family that ever argued all the way to church. You know what I mean? Like, when you start to get honest and there's that Me Too element, then I think people really start to listen.
I agree. And how do you handle the storytelling that you want to tell versus I guess maybe the best way to put it is dealing with the people above you? Have you ever wanted to tell a story and... Yeah.
But yeah, how do you balance the things that we want to do with our overseers? Or I think that's always, anytime you're a creative artist and you're in a, it doesn't matter if you're working for a client or you're working for a church. I mean, it's a very collaborative kind of process. What we try to do as much as possible is just make as many connecting points as possible. So before we pursue a story, a lot of times we'll talk about why we think this is a good story. We talk about sort of the value we see in it, and we don't ever get to a place where we've invested a lot of like production into it without having that conversation before. And so, I think what that helps do is just build a little trust that, we're looking for things that are going to, work well within a service. Because you can use stories in different ways. Like if you're working with a pastor, for example, or a preacher or teaching pastor, and you're working together to try to find a story that really hammers home a certain point, the best possible thing you can do is start to figure out, okay, what point are you trying to leave people with? What do you want people to catch? And then let's sort of work backwards and see if there is a story that we can, figure out for that. We also do videos like most churches do on Sundays, and that's sort of the bulk of our production time. But we also do stories in smaller settings. We do live storytelling, which is we have actually story nights where we've done this in our young adults ministry. We've done it in our women's ministry, student ministry, where we give people a chance to sort of just share their testimony, and our team kind of coaches them through a process to do that. And so that has been a great thing for our team to really begin to sort of pour into other people and disciple people, and, figuring out what their story is and giving them a chance to tell it. But also gives us a chance to have a lot of creative freedom that we wouldn't necessarily have on a Sunday, when everything kind of has to be a certain timing and a certain theme. And, the larger the church, the more services you're doing, or the busier you are, really, the more constraints you have. So, I don't know we've ever had a story that just got like the 86, like, sorry, it's just not good, or, you know what I mean? At the most, I think we've come up with a story and either had to rework some parts of it because of timing, or we just kind of postponed it to a different day because it just seemed to work better, with this kind of theme as opposed to this kind of theme. So, but we try to really work with leadership in terms of, what is it that you're trying to get across? And then we're going to go and try to find a story. Or if you send us a story that you think, hey, this is good, we're going to work with people to figure out, is this, really the story? Because it's happened to us too, that like we've gone out to tell a story and realized, like, actually the most interesting part about this story is something completely different than what you thought it was. We thought it was a story about forgiveness, and really it's actually a story about, something else. So it's just unlike, unlike a lot of other kind of creative elements of just graphic design, which is, I mean, amazing, but it's usually just kind of one thing. Like I like it, I don't like it. Or trying to think of something else like motion graphics or anything else. People either kind of thumbs up or thumbs down. With stories, they're human and they're very dynamic. You know what I mean? So, and usually they're about an hour long or at least a half an hour long. So you really kind of have to like get inside leaders' heads and then go when you're hearing a story, figure out what's the angle on the story, almost like a journalist. Like, what is it that is interesting about the story? What is it that speaks to people? What is it that connects the dots? And so there's just a lot of our work is actually just those connection points. And so really before we ever roll camera or, you know, go like do all the sort of the production work, and that's kind of the production work's the fun part. It's hard, but you know, that's kind of where we get to, you know, do all the creative stuff, which our team loves to do. But really all of that legwork to figure out, does this work or not? I feel like that takes up 60, 70% of our brain space, making sure that it's a good fit. So, but yeah, occasionally we'll have impulses to do something that our leaders aren't really all that excited about. And we'll either just sort of, you know, go swallow it and not tell the story, or we'll figure out some other way to tell it.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I think, I'm sure you have it, an open dialogue of where you've built up, I don't know what to say besides cachet or whatever, however you pronounce it, with your leadership to kind of go, okay, they've produced enough work that clearly we like what they're doing. They want to take this risk. Okay. Yeah. Or, depending on what the topic is.
Yeah. And there have been other times when, you know, we have a great story, but we can just tell in talking to the person, even just from a pastoral standpoint, like the person's not ready to share this. Like they're still grieving, or they're still, you know what I mean? It wouldn't be helpful for them to put them on a video screen in front of the entire church and like share the hardest thing they've ever walked through. Like that level of vulnerability is going to hamper their own healing process. And we've had those situations too, where you're like, you know what? Let's table this for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Let's revisit it. Let's see if it's the right thing. And I think that's especially in ministry, unlike, you know, advertising or marketing or something else, where it's just like, oh, this is gonna be awesome. Let's just script it and light it really cool and add music and get it on the air. This is much more like, this ministry is people. And so at the end of the day, you want to make sure, especially in a story, not just that it comes out well, but that the person feels honored, that it's, you know,
yeah,
yeah, exactly. You definitely don't want to like land on somebody when they're not really ready to tell it, or.
Well, exactly. And I can see it, and I know, having done it, it's a fine line to walk where you want to be able to tell their story, relate to people. But yet, like you said, it's not a car commercial. It's not something that they're going to be in church next week. You got to walk that line of getting them to be comfortable with the aftermath. And I've experienced that, where they're nervous about the story that they told and having to show them before and kind of walk them through and say, this is what we did. So that way they end up being excited about the opportunity to reach out to others instead of internally freaking out that you're going to embarrass them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it just, all that takes trust. You know, it's a vulnerable thing to share your story, especially the kind of stories we're usually looking for are big life stories. And so, I mean, you just can't build that kind of trust and relationship without time and without relationship, you know, without investing in relationship. And what I found is that if we don't really take the time to get to know people and see how they're doing and really just start walking the process out with them, we'll get the story, but we'll get kind of a bullet point, kind of church safe, sanitized version of it, where they kind of tell us what they feel like they want us to hear, because they've seen videos too. And they're kind of like, oh yeah, it all worked out in the end. And a lot of times when our team spends more time with people and develops more trust, you go a layer deeper, maybe a couple layers deeper, and you start to really get to those, like, me too. Like, I didn't think we were going to make it. In fact, there are moments where I'm still not sure we will, you know, like, you start really telling the truth, and people only open up in those kinds of situations when you keep giving them permission. Like, it's okay to tell, you're not going to get in trouble. Like, we're not going to let you say something that's so vulnerable and embarrassing. And we always show the story to people if they want to see it. And I think just anything that engenders trust is a good thing, because it's only in those environments. I mean, storytelling is probably closer to like confession than any other kind of spiritual discipline. And you think about like the old confessional booths with the priest, like that's about as private as it gets. And here it's like it's a confessional booth, but there's like 2 cameras, a shotgun microphone, lights, like we're probably in their house. So that's a really vulnerable place to be. And so I think in the beginning when it was just me and a camera trying to hack through it, I think I figured out a way to try to kind of put people at ease, but now we have specific team members, whose job it is to not do anything with tech, but just to spend time with that person and to walk them through it. And they're like, hey, at any point we can cut camera, just reassuring people, because, different people respond to all that differently. And most of the people.
Hey, I wanted to take a quick moment and tell you a little bit about Battle Cry Revival Marketing, the producer of this podcast. We believe that when businesses have quality marketing, it gives business owners the freedom to focus on what they do best. We design websites, produce videos, and create marketing materials to help our clients grow their business. Find out more at battlecryrevival.com. Now back to the show. Out on storytelling.
That probably goes back to the leadership question. We've done it a bunch of different ways at our church. I'd say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we were really trying to jam out a story almost every other weekend, I would say. Sometimes even 3 sort of Sundays a month. Now we're kind of more, I think, closer to about a story a month, a big story. And now we'll do other videos. We'll do kind of shorter form storytelling that's more sort of marketing, communications, we're going to let you know about this retreat or this mission trip. And here's a couple to let you know like how great it was. Like that's more kind of communications marketing in story form. And that usually doesn't take very long. But for like a big a film of, 4, 5, 6 minute sort of thing, I think it's possible to sort of overplay story on video and just do it so much that they all start to kind of feel the same. So once a month is a good rhythm for our church, for our team. And we try to be out ahead enough that we can kind of sort of figure that out. It's interesting. Our senior pastor just loves storytelling, and he doesn't really, this is weird. But he doesn't care if it goes with what he's preaching on that day. He just wants as many stories shared as possible. So there's a weird kind of freedom that we have to just sort of go, like if we feel like this is a good story, to just go for it. But that's very unusual. Most churches, that's definitely not how they roll. Yeah. Kind of needs to line up a little bit more. So, it's really like anything else in communications. It's just figuring out what's the expectation, which is always going to be too high. This is church, so most people aren't going to know what it takes to, sort of pull something off like that. But if you can really, again, just like working with leaders on the content of the story, you just work with leaders on, hey, we think this is going to take about this long. And, if we do this, we probably can't do these other 2 things. What do you think? Do you feel like we could just do one over the next couple of weeks or, and, it just depends on the dynamics. But for us, we've gotten it to about once a month.
Nice.
So that just gives us some breathing room to pull a team around it and talk about it and say,
exactly.
Is this too long? Like, and we're not just, if we're just always pedal to the metal, then I find like after a while, our work just isn't very interesting. We got it done, it's doing fine, but like it gets a little, I guess there's a difference between like a really great meal and like something you just sort of pick up at a fast food restaurant. It's just like those guys are chunking out, 900 hamburgers in 2 hours. And it's like, well, it was fine. It was good. But it's the difference between that and like a meal that someone like really, made for you. And you can tell they love doing what they do.
You mentioned that you had written a book. What was the name of it?
So the book that I wrote, that our team kind of helped put together, it's called Tell More Stories. And so it's online. It's a free ebook. And it's basically just a practical guide for churches who want to do storytelling, or maybe they're doing storytelling and they want to sort of put a finer point on it, but it's online at tellmorestories.co. Basically, I wrote it because I was talking to a lot of people, particularly in medium-sized churches or smaller churches, who their leaders had sort of discovered, we know stories are powerful. They make a huge impact. A lot of times the leader had been to a conference recently, or, they had seen something that really impacted them and they wanted to do that in the church. And so we know that a lot of creative leaders are just in the trenches. And so kind of trying to hack through whatever the projects are from week to week. And so the reason I wrote this book was basically just to give people a framework for what storytelling in the church actually is. And then to help you create a framework that's sort of based on who you are as a storyteller, because that's different from anyone else. What kind of church you're in, because again, the culture of my church is different than the culture of your church. And also what kind of stories you actually want to share. And so it basically just provides people a model or a framework, which is figuring out what you want to do with storytelling, getting more clarity in the process from beginning to end, figuring out what you want to do, but then also being able to execute from concept to planning, to filming, to editing, to final touches, just clarity all the way through that really, really helps. And then just focus, how to not only use video for storytelling, but also photography, written stories online, live storytelling. So we just kind of try to cover that from all bases, just to give church storytellers as many kind of points of reference as possible. And then we've also launched the Church Storytellers Facebook page as well. Yep. So, and we have, I think we have 999 members on the Church Storytellers page. So if one listener actually joins, we'll have 1,000 storytellers.
Fantastic.
And so in addition to the book and the website that we've created with some resources, that's also a really great community resource. People post their work. They say, what does this need? What do you guys think? Try this new light. We need a new mic. What would you guys recommend? And it's just, it's a community now of mostly filmmakers, but also writers, pastors, some authors on there, just to kind of share work and share ideas.
How can people reach out to you? How can they stay connected with what you've got going on?
The Storytellers page is probably the best, easiest way. So it's just Church Storytellers on Facebook, the group is. Or you can just hit me up. My email is info@tellmorestories.co. And so that kind of keeps you updated with, if we're doing future projects. We've got some sort of dedicated content that we're developing for the Storytellers page. Some opportunities for people to post work and get a series of filmmakers to give some kind of high level feedback for people who are wanting to grow in their work. We're thinking about starting a Church Storytellers podcast. We've been talking about it for a while, and you know how podcasts work. Like there's this idea, but then there's this whole other kind of workflow that has to go with it. And so a couple of, the moderators and other people in the group we've been rolling the idea around. So that might be something that's, coming up on the group hopefully in the near future.
Well, I think that would be a great idea. So.
Right on. Cool. Well, I'll take that endorsement to our team, and maybe that'll just push us a little closer to actually doing it.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And I'm a member of the Church Storytellers group, and I've learned a lot, and it's just a lot of fun to see other people in all stages of their career, where they're at, just kind of seeing it and going, oh, I learned that, or, oh, hey, I remember when I did that.
Yeah.
It's been a lot of fun. So.
Right on.
Thanks for tuning in. Break the Box is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you... Thanks for tuning in. Break the Box is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to help us out, a review would be greatly appreciated and is honestly the best way to help the podcast be heard by others. This podcast is produced by Battle Cry Revival Marketing and hosted by Jake Starkey. For show notes, visit battlecryrevival.com/podcast.